Chapter 1. My name is Elowen Hart, and the day my ex-husband walked out of divorce court with our house, our money, and almost everything I had spent 12 years helping him build, he laughed at the only thing I had left, my grandfather's crumbling cabin by the lake. What Gavin did not know was that cabin was hiding a key, 7 deeds, and a secret worth millions, and by the time he realized it, the woman he thought he had broken was the only person standing between him and the deal that could make or destroy his future. The padlock on the cabin door was so rusted I could not tell where the metal ended and the years began. I stood on the porch in the dark with 2 suitcases at my feet and a flashlight I had bought at a gas station 40 minutes back. And for one long stupid second I thought maybe this was what rock bottom looked like. Not the courtroom. Not the settlement papers. Not watching my husband walk away with the life I had helped build. This. Me in northern Vermont in the cold, locked out of the only place left with my name on it. The road up to Alder Lake had gone dark miles ago. No streetlights, no signal. No headlights except my own cutting through the trees until even that felt fragile. I had lost service somewhere after Bellport, and the silence that came after it felt bigger than silence usually does. Like the world had stepped back and left me alone with my thoughts. The cabin looked smaller than I remembered. Smaller, older, more tired. The porch leaned a little. The paint had given up. The windows were black. My grandfather had been gone for 3 years, and nothing in the place suggested anyone had touched it since. I tried the key twice, then 3 times, then pressed my forehead against the door and laughed once, sharp and humorless. Of course, the one thing I had left would be locked shut. I sat down on the porch step because I did not know what else to do. The boards were cold through my jeans. Somewhere out in the dark, water lapped against the dock my grandfather had built by hand when I was 9. He had shown me how to knot a rope there, how to gut a fish there, how to sit still long enough to hear something besides myself. Back then I thought the lake was quiet. Sitting there at 39 with 2 suitcases and nowhere else to go, I realized quiet and empty were not the same thing. 2 weeks earlier I had been sitting in family court in Windham County, while the clerk read my marriage back to me like an inventory list. The hearing was in Blackmere because that was where Gavin had filed, and Gavin always liked to choose the room before anyone else walked into it. He was already there when Derek Sloan and I arrived. Navy suit, crisp white shirt, hair trimmed, not one line out of place. He looked the way he always looked when he wanted a stranger to trust him. Composed, successful, almost kind. Derek was flipping through a folder so thin it made me want to cry before the hearing even started. He was not a bad lawyer. He was just the kind of lawyer a woman hires when she has already spent too much money surviving to afford a better one. He did legal aid work, family court, custody fights, emergency filings. He had a tired face and coffee on his cuff, and the look of a man who had been losing uphill battles all week. We sat down. Gavin looked straight ahead. That hurt more than if he had smirked. The judge moved through the assets the way doctors move through symptoms when they already know the diagnosis. The house in Brighton, the 2 vehicles, the investment accounts, the retirement fund, the brokerage holdings connected to Cross Mercer Development, the cash reserves, the line of credit. Every line item sounded cleaner than the life inside it had ever felt. I remember staring at my own hands while Gavin and Oppo's attorney explained that the residence had been acquired through the husband and Oppo's income stream, that the primary accounts were funded through the husband and Oppo's earnings and business activity, that the wife had not materially participated in the management of the marital assets. The wife. That was me. I wanted to stand up and say I had worked night shifts in the emergency room while Gavin studied for his licensing exams. I wanted to say I had eaten vending machine dinners under fluorescent lights while he took clients out for drinks and learned how to sound rich before he was. I wanted to say when we bought that house, I was the one who painted the kitchen cabinets myself because we were still counting every dollar. I wanted to say I had made our life possible in 100 invisible ways that looked like nothing once men in suits put it on paper. But Derek had told me ahead of time not to interrupt, not to react, not to make myself look emotional. Emotional. As if there were any other way to look while someone separated your life from your labor and decided they had never belonged together. The truth was Gavin had spent years building a system where everything ran through him. The mortgage was cleaner under his income. The cars were easier under the business. The investment accounts were in his name because he understood them better. The tax strategy made more sense that way. the reimbursement structure, the retirement planning, the insurance, the bookkeeping. He used to touch the small of my back and say, "Let me worry about the money, Ellie. You already carry enough." At the time it sounded like love. At the hearing it sounded like a trap I had mistaken for shelter. By the time the judge got to the cabin, the room had already taken almost everything that could be taken. My income had dropped years earlier when I cut back at St. and Apos' medical center, first because I was burning out, then because Gavin said one of us needed to have a life that wasn't Apos' triage overnight trauma. I had believed him when he said he could take care of us. I had believed stepping back was temporary. I had believed marriage still meant what I thought it meant when I was 27 and stupid enough to confuse being needed with being safe. The cabin was ruled separate. Inherited property. Low assessed value. Not materially incorporated into the marital estate. Gavin and Apos' attorney barely glanced at that section. Gavin did though. I saw it. Flicker. Mild annoyance maybe, or boredom. Years ago he had called it my grandfather and Apos' sad little fishing shack. Too far from town. Too old. Too dark. He had once asked me casually over dinner how much land came with it. Another time he had asked whether my grandfather still kept old paperwork in the house or if everything was at the bank. I had thought he was making conversation the same way I had thought all his most dangerous questions were curiosity instead of reconnaissance. The judge awarded me a small cash settlement that looked insulting even on the page. Derek squeezed my elbow and murmured that we were lucky to keep the inherited property. Lucky. Outside the courthouse, the air smelled like wet pavement and dead leaves. I sat in Tessa Cole and Apos' car and stared at the dashboard until she said my name twice. "You can stay as long as you need," she said. Tessa meant it. That was the problem. She meant it, and I still knew I could not stay long. Her apartment in Montpelier was one bedroom plus a corner she called an office because saying desk in the living room sounded sadder. She worked remote, took client calls from the kitchen, and tried not to make me feel like an emergency that had overstayed its category. I slept on her pullout for 9 nights and listened to her typing after midnight, and heard how carefully she moved around me. Kindness has a sound when it is strained. On the 3rd day I called my mother. She picked up on the 6th ring. "I heard about the divorce," she said. "No hello. No, how are you holding up?" "Just confirmation." "I am fine," I lied. There was a pause. Then she said, "Well, you always land on your feet." It was the kind of sentence people use when they want credit for faith they did not actually offer. I told her I might go up to the cabin for a while. Another pause. "Why would you do that?" "Because I don't and Apos' have anywhere else. You could ask Miles. He has that extra room." Miles had a home office with a treadmill desk and a rowing machine. I would have been sleeping in the gap between them like a guest in my own apology. I said I would figure something out. My mother made a small sound that could have meant anything. Then she said, "Your grandfather always did make you believe old things were worth saving." When I hung up, Tessa was standing in the kitchen doorway pretending she had not heard any of it. "You know the cabin is still yours, right?" she said gently. "You could go there. Just for a little while. Until you decide what comes next." That was how I ended up on the porch in the dark, with a deadlock and a dead marriage. I finally found a rock near the old woodpile and hit the padlock until it split. The sound echoed across the yard, harsh and ugly. The door gave way with a groan that felt almost human. The smell hit me first. Dust. Cold wood. Cedar. My grandfather used cedar blocks in drawers and closets because he said moths respected a house that smelled like a tree. I stepped inside and swept the flashlight slowly across the room. The plaid sofa was still there. The hand-built bookshelf. The iron stove. The small table where my grandfather used to deal cards in silence until he was ready to talk. His landscape paintings still hung on the walls, all of them stubborn and earnest and painted without any interest in whether the world considered them good. I set the suitcases down beside the couch and something inside me gave out. Not loudly, not dramatically, just all at once. I sat on the sofa and cried with my face in both hands until I could not tell if the shaking in my chest was grief or cold. After a while I stood up, wiped my face with the heel of my palm, and found the breaker box by memory. It took me 3 tries, but eventually the kitchen light flickered on. Yellow weak reel. I stood there in that old cabin in Arthur Hale and Apos' quiet little house by the lake, and looked around at the one thing no one had fought me for. the one thing no one had wanted. And for that first night, that was all I knew how to call mine. Chapter 2. By morning, the cabin had turned from sad to inconvenient. The kitchen light still worked, but only if I left the switch in exactly the right position. The hot water came in short bursts that never lasted long enough to wash my hair without planning it like a military exercise. One of the bedroom windows did not close all the way, and sometime around dawn I woke to a ribbon of cold air sliding across my face like a warning. I had forgotten how loud old houses could be when they were empty. Pipes ticking, floorboards settling, wind finding places it should not. I made coffee with a dented percolator I found in one of the cabinets, then stood at the sink waiting for the water to decide whether it wanted to run rusty, clear, or not at all. "This is insane," I muttered. My own voice sounded strange in the room, like the house was not sure it recognized me yet. I spent that first day trying to make the place livable enough to stay in without feeling pathetic. I swept dead bugs out of the corners. I wiped down the counters. I found extra blankets in the hallway closet that smelled like cedar and old winters. Under the kitchen sink, exactly where I remembered it, was my grandfather and Appo's toolbox. Every drawer inside it was labeled in his blocky handwriting. Flathead, Phillips, electrical tape, small wrench, large wrench, flashlight batteries. He had organized things the way some people pray, quietly, repeatedly, with absolute faith that order mattered even when nobody was watching. By noon my hands were raw from scrubbing. I had opened 2 cans of soup and decided one was enough if I added crackers. Money moved differently when you did not know how long you had to make it last. I kept doing numbers in my head while I worked. Gas, groceries, propane if the tank still had anything in it. The small settlement from the divorce felt smaller every time I thought about it. I drove into Millstone that afternoon because the refrigerator contained half a jar of mustard, a bottle of relish older than I wanted to think about, and nothing else. Main Street looked exactly the way small New England towns always look from a distance, comforting until you are the person who does not belong there. Brick storefronts. A diner with a neon sign missing one letter. A hardware store with rakes out front. The woman at the grocery checkout asked if I was visiting, and I heard myself say I used to come here with my grandfather, which was not an answer to her question but was the closest thing to one I had. Back at the cabin, I carried the bags inside and stood in the kitchen for a long time without unpacking them. The quiet came down around me in layers. There was no television on in another room. No traffic outside. No phone buzzing with messages I wanted to ignore. Just the cabin and my breathing and the stupid, humiliating fact that I was 39 years old and back in a place people only came to when they were hiding or healing, and I was not sure which one I was doing. That evening I called my mother again. She answered faster this time. "Are you still up there?" she asked. "Hello to you too. Well, are you?" "Yes." I heard her exhale, the sound sharp with judgment she would later deny. "Elowen, honestly, you always choose the hardest version of everything." I looked out the kitchen window at the lake, darkening under a pewter sky. "I did not choose this." "No," she said, "but once it happened, you chose to run off to a freezing cabin in the woods instead of acting like a grown woman and making a plan." That was the thing about my mother. She could take any wound and describe it as a personality flaw. "I'm making a plan," I said. "By doing what exactly?" "By getting through today." She was quiet long enough to make me wish I had never called. "Your grandfather always encouraged this in you," she said finally. "This attachment to old things. Old places. Sentiment is not a strategy." "No," I said before I could stop myself. "Neither is pretending I am fine." Another silence. Harder this time. "If you need to stay with Miles," she said, "you know he would help." "He would make space," I said. "That is not the same thing." "Then what do you want from me, Ellie?" There it was. The question underneath all the others. Not what do you need? What do you want from me? I looked down at my hand on the counter, knuckles white, and realized I did not have an answer that would not humiliate me more. "Nothing," I said. "Good night, Mom." I hung up before she could offer me another practical solution that felt like being folded smaller. The next day I kept myself moving because stillness was dangerous. I patched a split screen with tape from the toolbox. I cleaned the bathroom grout with an old toothbrush. I sorted the pantry and found chamomile tea, 2 mason jars of rice, and a stack of paper napkins from a diner that had closed before I turned 30. The cabin began to look less abandoned and more suspended, as if Arthur had stepped out one morning and simply never made it back. That thought hurt more than I expected. I found a pile of letters in the roll-top desk by the living room window. Most of them were from me. Birthday cards I had mailed from college. Thank you notes. Christmas cards with bad rushed handwriting and too many exclamation points. He had kept every one. Some still had the envelopes. I sat in his chair and touched my own name written years earlier in a hand I barely recognized. My grandfather had never once asked me to explain myself. Not when I changed shifts. Not when I stayed in a bad marriage too long. Not when I drifted from him in those years when I was trying so hard to be the kind of wife I thought I was supposed to be. He never made me feel like I had to audition for understanding. That evening, with the sun dropping early and the cabin already cooling, I stood on a chair to wipe down the large winter painting over the fireplace. It had always been my favorite. The lake frozen over, trees stripped bare, sky low and silver with snow threatening somewhere beyond the ridge. When I touched the frame, it shifted strangely under my hand. I frowned and steadied it with both palms. The painting felt heavier than it should have. I lifted it off the hook, awkwardly, and set it against the couch. Behind it, taped flat to the back of the frame, was a large envelope gone yellow at the edges. My full name was written across the front in my grandfather and Appo's hand. Elowen Hart. I stopped breathing for a second. Not metaphorically. My body genuinely forgot what came next. I crouched on the floor and peeled the old tape away carefully. Inside was a folded letter, a small brass key, and a business card. Thomas Wren, attorney at law. Main Street, Millstone. I read the first line of the letter and sat down hard on the rug. If you are reading this here, it means you came back. That was all it took to break something open in me. Not because it was mystical or dramatic, but because it was so exactly him. No wasted words. No sentiment for show. Just a man who had known me well enough to predict the shape of my failure, and still leave room for me inside it. The letter was short. He wrote that the cabin was the only place he could leave something for me that no one else would think to search. He wrote that there were truths a person could only carry once life had taken enough from them to make those truths matter. He wrote that I was not to mention this to my mother, or to Miles, or to anyone until I understood what I was holding. He said the key opened a box at First Heritage Bank in Millstone, and Thomas Wren would know what to do next. He did not say what was in the box. He did not say money. He did not say salvation. He did not say I am sorry for what happened to you, though somehow the whole letter felt like that without begging for tears. I sat on the floor with that key in my palm until the room turned fully dark around me. That night I barely slept. I lay in his bed staring at the ceiling, the letter folded on the nightstand, the key clenched in my hand so tightly it left a mark. It was not greed that kept me awake. It was something stranger and more dangerous. Expectation. Not that I was about to get rich. Not that my life would turn around by morning. Just the terrifying possibility that my story had not ended where everyone else had decided it did. The next morning I drove into Millstone before 9. Main Street was waking up slow. Trucks parked at angles, a woman sweeping the sidewalk in front of the bakery, someone carrying coffee across the street with both hands. First Heritage Bank sat halfway down the block in a stone building that looked too solid to care what decade it was in. Inside, the front desk smelled faintly of polish and paper. A woman with silver glasses looked up when I approached. "Can I help you?" I set the business card on the counter. "Think so. I need to ask about a safe deposit box." My grandfather and Appo's name was Arthur. Arthur and Appo's last name caught in my throat for a second, not because I did not know it, but because suddenly all of this felt more real if I said it out loud. Arthur and Appo's granddaughter, the woman said before I could finish. I blinked. Yes, something changed in her face. Not surprise. Recognition. One moment. A few minutes later a man in his 60s came through a side door, straightening his tie. He studied me with a look that felt almost gentle. "I and Appo's Gerald Pike," he said. "I knew your grandfather a long time. Come with me." He led me down a narrow hallway, then down another level into the vault. Metal boxes lined the walls from floor to ceiling. The air was cool and smelled faintly of stone and old paper. Gerald unlocked one side of a box and nodded for me to use the key in the other. My hand trembled once, then steadied. Inside was a thick file, a sealed legal envelope, and a small leather notebook held closed with a rubber band. For a moment I just looked. Not money. Not jewelry. Not a final sentimental trick. Paper. So much paper. Gerald cleared his throat softly. I and Appos. LL let you have some privacy. He stepped back toward the door. Then he paused. For what it and Appos? S. Worth, he said, your grandfather always said you would come when it mattered. When he was gone, I reached for the file and opened it. The first sheet was a property document. The second was too. So was the third. I turned another page, then another, and my pulse began to climb. These were not records for one small lot tucked behind the cabin. They were deeds. Multiple deeds. Different parcel maps. Different legal descriptions. Different acre counts. I sat down at the little table in the bank and Appos' private room with the file open in front of me, my grandfather and Appos' key still warm in my hand. Whatever Arthur had hidden from the rest of us, it was bigger than a cabin by the lake. I just did not know how much bigger yet. Chapter 3. The first deed I pulled free was for 32 acres on the north side of Cedar Hollow, bought in 1994 for less money than Gavin once spent on a client golf weekend. I stared at the page, then at the next one, then the next. Different parcel numbers. Different acreage. Different years. One tract wrapped along the eastern shoreline. Another cut across a ridge I remembered hiking with Arthur when I was little. Another included road frontage near the county access route. The legal descriptions blurred after a while, not because they were hard to read, but because my brain had started rejecting reality on principle. There was a knock on the partially open door before I could get through the fourth file. A man in a charcoal blazer stood there with reading glasses in one hand and a legal envelope in the other. He looked like the kind of person who kept paper records because he had outlived every reason not to. You must be Elowen. I am.
IAPOS. M. Thomas Wren.
Your grandfather told me that if this day ever came, you would look more angry than confused. That almost made me laugh. I can do both. I had a feeling. He stepped inside, closed the door behind him, and set the envelope on the table. Up close, he looked a little older than the age I would have guessed from the business card. Late 50s maybe. Gray at the temples. Knee tie. The kind of face that had learned not to waste movement. He looked down at the spread of deeds in front of me and gave one small nod. So you found the box. I found a key behind a painting. That sounds like Arthur. I looked at him carefully. Did you know about all of this the whole time? I knew enough to carry out instructions. Arthur did not believe in telling anyone more than they needed to know. Did that include me? Especially you. I should have been offended. Instead I felt tired. Thomas pulled out the chair across from me and sat down. Your grandfather began buying land around Cedar Hollow in the early 90s. Not all at once. Parcel by parcel. Whatever he could afford without borrowing. Timber money. Savings from the mill. A few well-timed purchases when other people needed cash faster than they needed pride. He slid one of the deeds toward me and tapped the name block. Notice what is not here. The owner was not Arthur Hale. It was Vale Timber and Land Trust. I looked up. This is a trust. Yes. And all of it is under this. All 7 parcels. I looked back down at the papers. 7. It sounded impossible when he said it plainly. Thomas opened the legal envelope and spread out a summary sheet, a map, and a typed memorandum with attachments clipped behind it. 231 acres total. Acquired between 1994 and 2021. The cabin sits on the original parcel. The rest was accumulated around it. I leaned back in the chair, suddenly aware that if I stood up too fast I might fall over. My grandfather lived in a 1-bedroom cabin and wore the same flannel for 20 years. That is not inconsistent with quietly owning land. He never told anyone. Thomas gave me a look over the top of his glasses. Arthur did not confuse privacy with poverty. A lot of people do. He walked me through it slowly. Vale Timber and Land Trust had been created in 2011. Arthur transferred earlier parcels into it, then continued purchasing under that structure. Property taxes were paid through the trust. Public records showed the land, but unless someone went looking carefully and knew where to keep looking, there was no obvious trail leading back to the old man at the lake. And I and Appos' Am the beneficiary, I said, still half disbelieving the sound of my own voice. The sole beneficiary? Why didn't an Oppos anyone contact me after he died? Because Arthur did not want anyone contacting you. Thomas folded his hands. He was very specific. No notice. No meeting. No transfer discussion. Nothing unless you found the materials yourself. I stared at him. That sounds insane. Thomas actually smiled. End quote. At the time I told him something very similar. What did he say? He said if he handed it to you while your life was comfortable, you would not understand what it was. He wanted you to receive it when you were strong enough to carry it. I looked down at the deeds again and felt something ugly and tender rise in my throat at the same time. That is a gamble, I said. It was. What if I never came back to the cabin? He said you would. The certainty of that hurt in a way I was not prepared for. Thomas reached for the map and turned it toward me. Colored outlines marked the parcels in different shades of blue and green, but together they made one shape. A ring. A hold. A hand closing slowly around the lake. Then he opened another folder. Northline Development Group. Halcyon Ridge Capital. Cedar Hollow Resort and Marina. I read the title twice before looking up. What is this? The reason your grandfather never sold. He laid out site renderings, financing summaries, environmental review notes, land use sketches. It was all sleek and polished and expensive looking in a way that made me instinctively distrust it. Waterfront condominiums.
Private marinas lips.
Event barn. Bah. Expanded road access. Hospitality village. The language was clean and ambitious and full of phrases like sustainable luxury and regional growth opportunity. Thomas tapped the parcel map again. The east shoreline is yours. The ridge is yours. Part of the key access frontage is yours. Without those, this project does not work the way they and Oppos V promised investors it will. I blinked at him. End quote. You and Oppos retelling me the shack Gavin laughed about in court is sitting in the middle of a resort project. I and Oppos am telling you the shack, as your ex-husband so eloquently described it, is attached to the land package every serious developer around here has wanted for years. Something cold settled into me then, but it was not fear. Not exactly. It was the first shape of power, and I hated that I only recognized it because I had already been stripped of everything else. Thomas must have seen something change in my face, because his expression softened. Your grandfather spent 3 decades building a wall around that lake. He just never built it where anyone thought to look. I let that sit there between us for a moment. Then I asked the question that had already begun moving through me like poison. Did Gavin know? Thomas did not answer immediately. He gathered the papers into 2 neat stacks, buying time. I Don and Oppos. Know what he knew exactly, end quote, he said. End quote. But I know one of the companies interested in the land has people in common with firms he has worked around. That ISN and Oppos. An answer. It and Oppos. The one I can defend. I looked at him for a long moment, then at the business folder again. He reached into his briefcase and took out a small leather journal, older than the others, held shut with a band. Arthur kept notes. Not personal mostly. Transactions. Impressions. Decisions. Some of it may help. Some of it may only upset you. That part is up to you. By the time I left the bank, the sun had shifted high and the whole town looked offensively normal. A woman was carrying dry cleaning. Someone laughed outside the diner. I wanted to grab strangers by the shoulders and ask if they had any idea what my morning had turned into. Instead, I drove back to the lake and turned down the gravel lane to Ruth Mercer and Oppos' house. Arthur had talked about Ruth often enough when I was younger that I still remembered where she lived. White farmhouse. Green trim. Garden beds gone to brown for the season. Wind chimes that sounded more thoughtful than cheerful. She opened the door before I had fully knocked. There you are, end quote, she said. She was in her 60s, short gray hair, clear eyes, hands that belonged to someone who knew the difference between dirt and soil. You knew I and Oppos come. I knew if Arthur was right you would. End quote. She stepped back from the door. End quote. Come in before you freeze. Her kitchen smelled like cinnamon and wood smoke. She poured coffee without asking if I wanted any, which was one of the first things about her I liked. For a while she let me sit there and warm my hands around the mug. Then she said, end quote, You and Appos have been to the bank. How do you know that? Because you look like someone who just found out an old man she thought she understood had a second life. That made me laugh once and then almost cry, which seemed to satisfy her sense of accuracy. I need to ask you something and quote, I said. And quote. And I need you to tell me the truth. I don't and Appos, know how to do much else. Did Gavin ever come up here before the divorce? Ruth did not blink. Yes. I felt my grip tighten on the mug. When? Years ago. 6, maybe 7. He came with another man in a county truck. Said they were looking at drainage and access on nearby property. He asked too many questions for someone pretending not to care. What kind of questions? Shoreline boundaries. Wetland buffers. Who owned what? Whether Arthur had ever considered selling. Whether the road could be widened. I stared at the steam rising from my coffee. He told me once that place was worthless. Ruth gave me a look that held no pity, only clarity. Men like that only call something worthless when they want someone else to stop looking at it. I swallowed hard. Did Arthur know? I called him the day Gavin came. Arthur drove over that evening. Sat at this very table. Didn't Appos, raise his voice. Didn't Appos, look surprised. Just got quiet in that way of his that meant some part of him had clicked into place. What did he say? Ruth looked out the window toward the trees, remembering. He said, then it and Appos, sooner than I thought. The room seemed to tilt by half an inch. He already knew. He suspected enough to prepare. I sat there feeling heat climb up my throat, not from the coffee. Gavin had not just walked away from me cleanly. He had been circling something I did not know I owned the right to protect. Ruth got up, went to the counter and came back with the journal Thomas had given me. Read the back third and quote, she said. And quote, that and Appos. When Arthur stopped writing like a buyer and started writing like a man fortifying a border. I opened it with shaking hands. Dates. Parcel numbers. Timber notes. Easement references. And then, near the end, fewer numbers and more observations. One line stopped me cold. Some men do not love what is theirs. They love access. I read it twice. Then below it, a later entry in the same hand. If he asks about the lake before she does, I was right. I closed the journal slowly and set my palm over the cover as if that could steady the world. Ruth did not say anything for a while. She did not need to. When I finally looked up, the kitchen felt smaller than it had 20 minutes earlier. This was no longer a sad story about a woman who lost a divorce and came home to a cabin. Arthur had not just left me land. He had left me a position. And somewhere between the courthouse and the lake, my life had crossed over into something else entirely. Chapter 4. The next morning my phone started lighting up before I had even finished my coffee. Gavin and Appos' name kept appearing across the screen with the same polished urgency he used in boardrooms and court hallways. We need to talk. This is getting bigger than you think. Do not make decisions before hearing me out. I left every message unopened. That was new for me. During our marriage I had answered too fast, explained too much, apologized before I understood what I had done wrong. Silence had always felt rude or childish or dangerous. Up at Cedar Hollow with Arthur and Appos' journal on the table and the lake beyond the glass, silence began to feel like a locked door I finally knew how to use. I spent that morning doing ordinary things with shaking hands. I tightened the loose hinge on the screen door. I stacked wood by the stove. I made a list of what the cabin still needed before real cold set in. Pipe insulation. Weather stripping. Groceries. Fuel. Every small task gave my fear somewhere to go. By noon my mother called. I let that ring twice too, then picked up. Ellie, are you busy? That depends on why you are asking. She paused, just enough for me to hear her deciding how to phrase whatever came next. I spoke to Miles. He said you seem settled in. Settled is a generous word. I also heard there may be interest in that property. I stared at the chipped rim of my coffee mug. So that was how fast information moved. Not in facts, not in documents, but in rumors with enough money attached to them. Who told you that? You know how towns are. People talk. No, Mum. People talk when someone gives them something to talk about. Her voice tightened. I am only saying this because I am your mother. If there is real money involved, you need to be careful. Your grandfather was a good man, but he was not always fair. He had favorites. There it was. Not concern. Arithmetic. Arthur left me what he wanted to leave me. I am not arguing that. I am saying family should handle things like family. That has not exactly been the family tradition around here. She ignored that. If there is something substantial, Miles deserves to understand what is happening too. I laughed once, not because it was funny. Miles deserves to understand it. He is your brother. And where was he when I was sleeping on Tessa and Appo's couch? My mother went quiet in the offended way people do when the truth arrives before they are ready for it. You have always been dramatic when you are hurt, she said. And you have always mistaken distance for strength. I ended the call before she could turn my pain into another character flaw. An hour later, Miles showed up in a dark pickup with 2 grocery bags and a red gas can in the bed. He stood on the porch awkwardly, like a man arriving at a funeral he had already missed. I figured you could use a few things, he said, lifting the bags. Milk, eggs, some kin stuff. Gas for the generator if you need it. Thanks. I'm not trying to pry. I just looked at him. He gave a weak half smile. Okay, maybe a little. Mom is wound up. She thinks something is going on. Something is always going on with Mom. He set the bags down inside the kitchen and glanced around the cabin. I forgot this place smelled like cedar. Arthur used to keep blocks of it in every drawer. Yeah. For a second he sounded almost like my brother again. Then he rubbed the back of his neck. So is it true there is some kind of land deal happening up here? I kept putting groceries away. There is interest in the area. That is not really an answer. It is the answer I have. Miles leaned against the counter, not pushing but not backing off either. I am not Gavin, Ellie. No. You are not. Then why does it feel like you are talking to me like I am? I turned and looked at him fully. Because right now I cannot tell who wants to help me and who wants to help themselves by standing near me. That landed harder than I meant it to, but it was true. Miles looked down at the floorboards. I came because I thought you might need groceries, he said quietly. And quote, not because of some payoff. I know you did. He nodded once, but I could see the hurt in him, and under that, the old habit of retreat. Miles was not cruel. He was worse in a quieter way. He was decent, just often enough to disappoint you when it mattered. After he left, I drove into Millstone for a meeting Thomas had arranged with Northline Development Group and their counsel from Halcyon Ridge Capital. Before I got there, I stopped at Linda Shaw and Appo's diner for coffee and pie I did not need. She slid the plate in front of me and lowered her voice like the whole room was already listening. You are Arthur Vale and Appo's granddaughter, right? I am. He was a good man. He was. She nodded toward the window, where 2 men in work jackets were talking beside a contractor truck. People are saying the lake and Appo's finally going to change. Some folks think that is overdue. Others think it will ruin the place. I did not realize I was now a public utility. Linda gave a short laugh. In a town this size, land is never just land. It is jobs, taxes, traffic, noise, inheritance, and gossip. Usually in that order. By the time I reached Thomas and Appo's office, I understood something I had not fully felt yet. Cedar Hollow was no longer only the setting of my collapse. It was becoming a contested future, and whether I liked it or not, people had started looking at me as the hinge. Cole Danner was already there when I arrived, immaculate and self-possessed, with Vanessa Reed beside him and a portfolio open on the table. Cole stood to shake my hand. Miss Vale. Hart, I said. And quote, still. Of course. Thank you for coming. Vanessa gave me the sort of smile lawyers use when they want to appear respectful, while measuring how much resistance a room will offer. The presentation began exactly the way I expected. Growth. Jobs. Responsible development. Environmental stewardship. Regional opportunity. They spoke as if they were bringing civilization to a blank map instead of trying to assemble a resort on land people already loved for other reasons. When Cole finished, he folded his hands. We believe this project can benefit everyone involved. I looked at the site map for a long moment. How does your drainage plan work without the East Shoreline Corridor? Cole and Appo's expression barely changed, but I saw it. The current concept anticipates access through the eastern parcels. And if that access is not available, we would revisit engineering. I nodded and tapped another section. What about road frontage? You are counting on the county route expansion being useful to guest traffic. Without Parcel 7, where does that happen? Vanessa answered that one. We are exploring multiple scenarios. That sounds expensive. Cole smiled thinner now. Large projects involve flexibility. So does leverage, I said. Neither of them spoke for a second. That silence told me more than the folder had. When I got back to the cabin, Gavin and Appo's black SUV was already parked near the tree line. He was standing on the porch, one hand in his coat pocket, looking out at the lake like he had any right to the view. Can I come in? He asked when I got out of the car. No. He accepted that too easily, which meant he had rehearsed this. We stood outside instead, late afternoon wind moving through the pines. I know you are angry he said. You took my house, Gavin. Angry is not exactly the word. He gave a small exhale, the kind meant to sound regretful. I did not want court to go the way it did. That line would work better if you had not paid for it. His jaw tightened, but only briefly. This is not about that. No. It is about land. He studied my face, recalculating. I am trying to stop you from making a mistake. You mean a decision you do not control. Ellie, listen to me. You are one person. What is tied up around this lake is bigger than you understand. I understand enough. I understand Northline. I understand Halcyon Ridge. I understand you have known exactly what is sitting out here for longer than you ever admitted. His eyes changed then. Not surprise. Exposure. You do not know what you are stepping into. I know you spent years laughing at this place and now your entire posture changes when I own it. He took one step closer. We could handle this together. I almost smiled. You already handled things together, Gavin. In court. The wind hit the porch screen behind us hard enough to rattle it. I am offering you help. No, I said. You are offering yourself access. For the first time since he arrived, he had no ready answer. I let the silence stay there until it belonged to me. Then I said, leave. He looked like he wanted to say something cutting, something clean and final. But all he managed was a flat nod before he turned back toward the SUV. I thought that was the end of it. It was not. Thomas called the next morning, while I was on my knees stuffing insulation strip around the bedroom window. We have a problem, he said. My stomach dropped before he said another word. Gavin and Appo's counsel filed a challenge. They are claiming the trust should have been disclosed as a potential beneficial interest during the divorce. I did not know it existed. I know that. The issue is not whether they are right. The issue is whether they can freeze movement long enough to pressure you. I sat back on my heels on the cold floor. What does that mean in plain English? It means delay. Expense. They do not need to win immediately. They just need you tired. After I hung up, I stood in the kitchen and looked around at the cabin. The groceries Miles brought. The list on the table. The old stove. Arthur and Appo's journal. I had land on paper, but paper did not pay for legal defense, furnace repair, or the life I still had to keep living. That afternoon I opened my laptop and looked at postings for nursing shifts within driving distance.
Per diem.
Weekend coverage. Rural clinic float. It made me feel sick and relieved at the same time. Not because work was beneath me, but because I had just inherited something enormous and still felt one bad week away from asking how much eggs cost before I put them in my cart. I drove to Thomas and Appo's office the next morning with the journal on the passenger seat. He was already searching through a gray file cabinet when I walked in. I remembered something after we spoke, he said. Or rather, Arthur made sure I would. He pulled out a green file, thick with tabs and annotations. What is that? A contingency package. Prepared in 2018. Independent legal opinions on the trust structure, beneficiary knowledge, disclosure exposure, and intended separation from marital assets. I stared at him. He planned for this. Thomas gave a dry, almost admiring laugh. He planned for many things I thought were excessive at the time. I am reconsidering. He opened the file and turned it toward me. Arthur was not a prophet. He was just cautious to a degree most people find exhausting. For the first time in days, I felt my lungs fill all the way. A week later, Gavin withdrew the challenge. No epalegi. No concession. Just a legal retreat dressed in neutral language. That evening I carried my coffee onto the porch and sat looking out over Cedar Hollow while the last of the light slid off the water. The fear was still there, but it had changed shape. It was no longer the fear of losing everything because I had already done that. It was the fear that comes right before you realize the people pressing hardest on you may actually be the ones with less room left to move. And as the wind came off the lake and moved through the pines, I understood it clearly for the first time. They needed my land more than I needed their money. Chapter 5. For the first time since the divorce, I stopped thinking only about what I could survive and started thinking about what I wanted to keep. That turned out to be a harder question. Selling would have solved a lot fast. One signature, one wire transfer, one clean exit. I could have paid off every last bill, bought a small house somewhere no one knew me, gone back to work on my own terms, and called the whole thing a brutal lesson with a profitable ending. There were nights when that version of the future looked almost holy in its simplicity. Then I would sit at Arthur's table with his journal open beside my coffee and realize selling everything would only be one more way of handing over the shape of my life because I was tired. Arthur never wrote like a man trying to sound wise. He wrote like a man recording weather, timber, acreage, and human weakness with equal respect for all four. Near the back of the journal, in a place where the entries had gotten shorter and more deliberate, he had written that land did not become power when you sold it. It became power when you decided who got to use it, how long they got to use it, and what it cost them to forget it was never really theirs. I read that line until I stopped hearing it in his voice and started hearing it in my own. Thomas came to the cabin 2 days later with a legal pad, a manila folder, and the kind of expression that meant he already knew I was about to make his life more complicated. "You are thinking about not selling," he said before he even sat down. "I am thinking about not disappearing." He looked at me for a moment, then nodded once. "That is a better answer." We spent the afternoon working through what that would actually mean. Not a sale. A long-term ground lease. 55 years, not forever. Mandatory review every 10. Fixed annual payment. A percentage of gross revenue. Environmental protections tied to water quality, shoreline use, timber limits, and runoff controls. Reversion rights if the project changed purpose or stalled beyond a certain point. Title staying exactly where Arthur had left it, in Vale Timber and Land Trust. The more we built it out, the steadier I felt. This was not revenge in the childish sense. I was not trying to burn anything down. I was refusing to sell the foundation under my feet just because the people across the table wanted convenience. Thomas tapped the legal pad with his pen. "If you do this, Halcyon will fight for a cleaner structure. They will say ownership complicates financing." "It does." "Yes. Then they can pay for the complication." That got the smallest smile out of him. Arthur would have liked that. "No," I said. He would have said it with fewer words. The final meeting took place in a conference room at a private office building in Montpelier, the kind of place designed to make everyone sound more reasonable than they really were. Cole Danner was there. Vanessa Reed was there. This time they had brought Richard Halston from Halcyon Ridge Capital, silver-haired, measured, impossible to charm by accident. Thomas sat beside me with 2 folders in absolute calm. I wore a dark sweater, simple earrings, and nothing that looked like I was trying to dress up for their approval. For the first time in months, I walked into a room without the feeling that I needed permission to take up space in it. Richard looked at me over folded hands. "Ms. Hart, I understand you have an alternative proposal." "I do." I slid the term sheet across the table. Cole read the first page, then the second, then stopped. Vanessa took it from him. Richard did not touch it right away. He read my face first. "This is highly unusual," he said. "Not from where I sit." He finally looked down at the document. "You are refusing an outright purchase." "Yes." "You understand that a sale would immediately secure you more liquidity than a lease." "Yes." "And yet you prefer long-term control." "I prefer not making the same mistake twice." Nobody asked what mistake I meant. They all knew. Richard read in silence for another minute. Cole was the first to push back. "This structure adds substantial complexity to financing. It also keeps your project alive," I said. Vanessa set the pages down. "You are asking for annual payments, participation in gross revenue, environmental restrictions, reversion clauses, and periodic review. From an investor standpoint, that is a significant burden. From an ownership standpoint, that is called memory." Cole leaned forward. "You are not in the strongest position you think you are." I looked at him and answered without heat. "Halcyon already has money sunk into parcels on the west side. Northline has spent years assembling a footprint that only makes sense with my land package included. And your financing window does not stay open because I am being polite. So with respect, I think I understand my position just fine. Richard's mouth moved very slightly at one corner. Not a smile. Recognition. Then the door opened. Gavin stepped in like he still belonged everywhere decisions were made. He had on one of his city suits again, charcoal this time, expression set somewhere between composed and urgent. For one absurd second I saw the whole marriage in that doorway. All those years of him entering rooms first and assuming I would follow. Thomas stood before I did. This is a private negotiation. Gavin ignored him and looked at Richard. I should be here for this. No one said anything right away. The room seemed to tighten around the silence. Then I spoke. No, you should not. Gavin turned to me. Elowen, you challenged the trust that holds this land while your business interests were tied to the project trying to secure it. You are my former husband, not a neutral party. And the only reason you are in this room is because you still think access is the same thing as entitlement. Cole looked at Richard. Vanessa looked at the table. I kept going, not louder, just clearer. You laughed at this place when you thought it was worthless. You came back when you realized it was useful. That is not concern. That is conflict. Gavin's face changed then. Not dramatically. Just enough. Enough for Richard Halston to see the thing he needed to see. Richard turned to him. I think it would be best if you waited outside. For the first time since I had known him, Gavin had no language ready. He stood still for a beat too long, then walked out without another word. The door closed softly. That softness made it worse for him somehow. No explosión. No scene. Just removal. Richard picked up the term sheet again. Where were we? Took 12 more days. Not because they wanted to say yes, but because the numbers made no cleaner answer possible. Halcyon negotiated hard on timing, reporting, and review mechanics. Thomas pushed back where it mattered and gave ground where it did not. I learned more in those 12 days than I had learned in 12 years of marriage about the difference between being included in a life and controlling one. When the final agreement came through, I sat at Arthur's kitchen table with the signed packet in front of me and read my own name until it looked unfamiliar. The land remained in the trust. The lease ran 55 years, subject to review every decade. There was a fixed annual payment large enough to keep me standing, plus a percentage of gross revenue. The environmental protections stayed. The reversion clauses stayed. Nothing that mattered had been sold. Thomas called that evening to tell me one more thing. Halcyon cut Gavin out completely, he said. Conflict concerns. Internal risk. He is done with the project. I looked out at the lake while he said it. A year earlier that news would have thrilled me in a bright, ugly way. Now it settled somewhere quieter. Not mercy. Not triumph exactly. Just balance. Marjorie tried once more after that. She called with the same warm poison she had always used, talking about stress, reputations, and how men sometimes make mistakes when they feel cornered. I let her finish. Then I said, he was not cornered. He was confident. That was the problem. She never called again. My mother called too, all stiffness and wounded pride, talking about how families should not drift apart over property. I told her property was not the reason we had drifted. It had only revealed the distance more clearly. Miles texted once asking if I was okay. I answered that I was. It was the truth and also all he was going to get. A week after the contracts were signed, I carried Arthur's old easel onto the porch. The air had turned sharp. The maples had gone red at the edges. Light moved over Cedar Hollow in bands, silver first, then pale blue, then gold. I set out brushes I barely knew how to use and opened the old paint box I had found in the hall closet. The first version was terrible. The dock leaned sideways. The water looked heavy. The far treeline had no perspective at all. I almost laughed when I stepped back. Then I remember being 10 years old, showing Arthur a painting so bad it could have been weather damage, and him saying I was looking too hard for permission instead of just looking. So I kept painting. When I finished, I signed the bottom corner with my name. Not Mrs. Cross. Not someone's beneficiary. Not the woman who got left with 2 suitcases and a dead lock. Just Elowen Hart. I hung the canvas inside that evening, on the wall beside Arthur's landscapes. Mine was the clumsiest one there by far, but it belonged in the room anyway. After dark I sat on the porch with a blanket over my knees and listened to the water strike the dock in the same steady rhythm I had heard the night I arrived. Only now it sounded less like grief and more like proof. The house was still old. The windows still needed work. Winter would still come. None of that had changed. What had changed was me. Gavin had taken the house, the accounts, the version of my life that looked respectable on paper. But Arthur had left me the one thing none of them understood until it was too late. Not money. Not luck. Ground. And once I understood what I was standing on, I stopped asking anyone else where I belonged. If you have ever had to start over with the thing everyone else dismissed, then you already know some endings are really just ownership in another form. Stay with me. There are more stories after this one, and they all begin where someone thought the last page had already been written.